Hello and welcome to episode 56 of the Page One podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing career, their process, how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. We are back after a short break. I hope you had a good Christmas and New Year period, or as good as it can be in the time of COVID. And we did put up some stuff for you to listen to and get distracted by. We put the audio of our video podcast, the Page One Sessions, which are sort of chats with multiple authors about their writing. So you can find those in the back catalogue as well as all of our previous guests. So please do check that out. What about you, Tarek? Did you have a good Christmas and New Year?
Yeah, it was very nice. It was very quiet.
Yeah,
the quietest New Year for certain I could think of for a while. We kind of sat up. I think we watched a movie and then played a board game, and then it got to midnight and I was like, right, yeah, it's time to go to bed now.
Yeah, exactly. Just forcing yourself to stay up.
It's not really the same, is it, when you're just kind of staying up for the sake of it?
No, exactly. But it was, I suppose in a way it was nice to have a different sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
You know,
to be honest, I'm not really a massive I'm more of a Christmas guy than a New Year guy.
Mm-hmm.
So
definitely.
Yeah.
It was good not to have that pressure to find a great party or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or turn up at the pub at like 11:30.
Yeah, exactly.
Standing at the bar.
Standing outside in the street, freezing cold, watching fireworks.
Anyone that doesn't know Marco, that's Marco's biggest fear, is standing outside in the cold.
Yep, that's true. I'm not sure fear is the right word, but certainly dislike, perhaps.
Never seen a grumpier man stand around the bonfire as Marco. On multiple occasions.
But anyway, we are into a new year, of course, and of course there is still madness going on, but we like to try and distract you from that for about an hour a week. And we've got a great guest for you this week.
We do indeed. This week we are chatting with Sharon Bolton, or SJ Bolton, as she is also known in some of her books. She's a crime author. She's had a number of books out now. Her latest is The Split, which was a Richard and Judy book club pick, which is very exciting. I think it's one of the largest kind of boosts you can really get to your books.
Yeah, definitely in the UK, it's
sure.
Sort of the equivalent of the sort of Oprah Winfrey book list or book club or whatever it is. So yeah, it's a big thing to be picked for that. She's as you say, she's written a series of crime novels, sort of not supernatural crime, but you know they're always, it's not your straight laced crime. I would say there's always a hint of something else, even if there isn't actually supernatural elements, as she talks about. And she's written both standalone books and sort of a recurring series with a character called Lacey Flint, which is very popular. And she talks to us about bringing Lacey Flint back, which I think will be great news to a lot of people because she is a popular character.
Yeah.
So we'll get straight into the podcast after a quick advert for our notebook, the Page One notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer? Was that always your goal?
No. For the longest time, it never occurred to me that I could do it. And looking back, I almost want to sort of slap my forehead and go, duh, because all the signs were there. I've always had a very active imagination. I'm one of those people that have another life, a much more exciting one going on in their heads. And I've always read massively. And for a long time, my job involved writing. It wasn't writing fiction. I was working in public relations. So I was writing press releases and advertising copy and that sort of thing. So for 15 years, I was developing my skill as a writer about learning to use words to best effect. But I still didn't join the dots until one day, and this story is so embarrassing. I wish I could stop telling it, but I had to have to invent something then. I was working in financial services, and I took a journalist out to lunch. And he was a lovely chap. He worked for the Mail on Sunday. He didn't want to talk about life insurance and pensions, and neither did I. So we just got to chatting, and he told me he'd just taken a week off work to write a novel for Mills and Boon. He said they pay £15,000 per novel for 50,000 words, £15,000 for 50,000 words that he thought he could do in a week. That's journalist for you. This was quite a long time ago. And I thought, oh gosh, that's a lot of money. And I had a big student loan at the time. I thought I could really use £15,000. So by the time I got home that night, I had the plot of a Mills and Boon novel all in my head. And I sort of took my laptop upstairs to my bedroom, and I'd started writing this Mills and Boon novel. And it was like falling off a log. It just came pouring out. Now, I never actually had anything accepted by Mills and Boon. And if you've read my books, you'll probably think that's a very good thing. It changed a much-loved genre beyond all recognition. But that was the start of the process for me. That was when I learned that I could do it. And that actually I really enjoyed doing it. So from that moment on, it became a bug. And I knew what, I would have to keep on trying to write fiction and trying to get published.
And so that your first book was that sort of Mills and Boon type story. Did you then think, right, what do I want to write about now, and move into that path?
I mean, you two will both know this. You have to write the sort of book you love to read. And I've never really loved romantic fiction. So I was doing that for money, and it's not surprisingly, it didn't work. So I had to wait for the right story to come along. And it wasn't too long in coming, because a little while after that, my sister and her family bought a plot of land by an old church on the moors in Lancashire. They wanted to build their dream house. But of course, when you buy land next to a church, you're buying land next to a graveyard, and that's what their house overlooks to this day. And I went up to stay with them quite early on in their sort of residence there. And one morning, I got up quite early. I took my niece downstairs for breakfast, and it was dark outside, and the mist was rising over the graveyard. I thought, oh, this is a spooky place. This is a good place to set a novel. And shortly after that, they found human remains in their back garden. And they learned that churchyard boundaries can move over time, because churches are usually hundreds of years old, and that it's not unusual for bones to pop up on the wrong side of the wall. They also learned that if bones are more than 100 years old, they're just put back in the ground and forgotten about. But if they're not, then a police investigation will kick in. Well, these were obviously very old, so they were buried, and that was that. But that got me thinking, could there be a better place in the world to hide a body than a graveyard? And just suppose in a heavy storm, a churchyard wall collapses, the graves behind it open up, and more bodies come out that are supposed to be in there. So that was the start of a book that eventually became Blood Harvest, and that was what really sort of set me going on the right path.
And what was the process in terms of getting that published? Did you have to search a long time for an agent, or did you find it quite easy to find that?
It was long and hard. I wrote it as a ghost story, and I made so many mistakes. I wrote it as a 250,000 word ghost story. Now, you both know commercial fiction, probably 100,000 words, that's the maximum they're looking for. So nobody wanted to publish a book of that length. And it really was a rookie novel. So I sent it off to every agent in the book, and every agent in the book sent it back. And I almost gave up at that point. But I'd had another idea that by this stage, a sort of the idea of a woman who really wanted to be pregnant and who conceived something that somehow brings about her downfall. I thought, I want to write this story. I'm just going to give it one last go. So I wrote that book, which eventually became Sacrifice. And it took quite a long time because I had a young child myself at this stage, and he wasn't a great sleeper. So I was writing around him. So I started work while I was pregnant. And just when he went to primary school, I got an agent, and the book went to the Frankfurt Book Fair. And it was auctioned there, and it ended up selling, for quite high figures to publishers all around the world. So finally, then I'd had the big start that we all dream about, but I had to work quite hard for it.
I mean, it sounds like that's a 5-year gap or so then from writing Sacrifice to get it picked up at the Frankfurt Fair. I mean,
it probably took the better part of 5 years to write it,
right?
Because I was writing around a very young child, so days and days would go by when I just didn't get the chance. And in many ways that worked in my favor, because Sacrifice and the sort of book I write, they're quite fantastical thrillers. There's an element of they're very strongly gothic thrillers. There's an element of not the supernatural, but a hint of that something a little bit weird could be going on. And I think if I'd written Sacrifice in a year and pitched it in sort of 1996, it would have been rejected because the market wasn't looking for books like that at that time. But by the time 2000 and I've got my years mixed up, but by the time I did come to send it off, I'd had a lot of luck because Dan Brown had taken the world by storm with his, very sort of with his religious thrillers. And so suddenly publishers were looking for books that were a little bit different, that were thrillers, that were exciting, that had an element of crime in them, but were just had a bit of a fantastical twist, which seemed to describe Sacrifice very well. So it was the right book at the right time. There's a huge amount of luck in publishing. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, that process of, sending out to agents and being rejected.
Soul destroying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can make a lot of people give up at that point because, they just can't see the way through it to should they stick at it? Because writing a book, of course, isn't something that you do on a couple of evenings. It takes a long time. It's a long commitment. And then to have no success, sometimes not even any real feedback on it, it can be quite disheartening, I think.
Absolutely, yes. For most people who are not writing full time, it will take several years to finish that book. So to start that process for the second or the third time with no hope of a destination in sight, it's hard. It takes a particular sort of person, frankly, to keep doing it.
And obviously, because you said that you started writing Blood Harvest as your kind of first serious crime book that you wrote, but then that was, am I right in saying that was your third book that actually did end up coming out? So obviously you kind of put that away in a drawer and said, right, I'm going to go into Sacrifice, but then down the line you pulled it back out and said, I've got this book which I'll do some work on, but it's pretty much ready to go almost. Is that quite a good thing, having that book in the drawer?
Exactly what happened, yes. Yeah. I was kind of struggling for an idea for my third book, and so I went back to the first book I ever wrote. I thought, there is a story here. I've got to strip out all the ghosts. I've got to make it a lot shorter, but the characters, the setting, the underlying story of the lost little girls and the graves that have more bodies in them. There's a story here. So I rewrote it and it became Blood Harvest.
And when you were first published, I was reading about this earlier today. You were SJ Bolton as opposed to Sharon Bolton. Do you want to tell us why that was and why it's changed since then?
Publishing decisions both times. Back in 2006, I think I had my Sacrifice was offered a publishing contract. And my editor said, we love this book, but we think if we publish you as Sharon Bolton, a lot of men won't pick it up. Because at the time, apparently, men in the United Kingdom were quite reluctant to buy a book with a woman's name on the cover, especially in this genre, which was very much not the case in other European countries, because I sold in Germany very quickly, where they liked nothing better than a really nasty book written by a woman. So in lots of European countries, I was Sharon Bolton from the outset. But my British publishers thought it would be better to do a bit of a J.K. Rowling and trying to disguise my gender. So we published as SJ Bolton, but things changed. Social media really took off. So in the years following Sacrifice coming out, I had a website, I was on Twitter, I was blogging, I was on Facebook. It was blindingly obvious that I was a woman. And another thing was going on. Lots of people were publishing with their initials. And strangely, J is a very popular middle initial. I felt I was getting lost in a sea of, SJs and CJs. Around about my sixth book, the publisher said, look, maybe it's time to come out and admit that you're female. So we'll change. They were trying to give a big push to the new book. So that's the story behind that.
It sounds so strange, even because it wasn't that long ago when your books came out, to think even back then that was a viewpoint in the UK. It almost makes you think of back in the Victorian times when you had to take a man's name to hide the fact that you were a woman. And it's interesting to see that the kind of catalyst for that change was the fact that actually comes a point when you can't hide that anymore. And
exactly.
Unless you're going to start having a fake social media account to try and keep up for pretense.
But it is a real thing, because I've had people come onto my Facebook page and say, or on Amazon, and say that they don't buy books written by women,
really,
because women, they spend too much time writing about feelings instead of just getting on with it. And it's a point of view. If that's the sort of book you like, read the authors who don't bother too much.
Interesting. And am I right in saying that you made up the J? You don't actually have a middle name J. That was just a letter.
It all seemed to be happening very quickly. Maybe I panicked a bit. I just thought,
And your books are all sort of set in the same, or not all of them, because we'll come on to your new book very shortly. But a lot of your books are based in Northern England, where you're from. Is that something? Is that part of the sort of cliche of write what you know? Do you think it's important to have a grounding in this type of stories that in the location of the type of stories you want to tell?
I think the opposite.
Right. Okay.
I know. And I'm not sure most of my books are set in Northern England. Some of them are, certainly. But if anything, I find that harder to write. It's harder to write about an area I know extremely well. No, I don't. All authors fall into two camps on this. There are some who say you absolutely have to visit your book locations. You have to do your research thoroughly. You have to tick every box. And it's a point of view, but it's not one that I subscribe to. I think there is so much material on the internet and in previously published works, both fiction and non-fiction. There's a whole library of knowledge available on YouTube with video programs that have been produced. You can learn as much as you need to about a location without visiting yourself.
Yeah.
And two, I wrote Sacrifice without going to the Shetland Islands because I had a very young baby, and we were living on one income at the time. It was an expensive trip. I just couldn't justify it. When it started selling around the world, I thought, bloody hell, I better get up there. So I did follow the route of the book around, just checking that I've got everything right. So I would set that's the way I prefer to work, to write from research and imagination, and then visit at the end of the process to check. Now, two books, including the one that you're going to ask me about shortly, have been set on opposite sides of the world, so I haven't been able to visit those.
So is research, do you spend a long time doing research into your novels? What is that process? Do you get an idea and then spend a lot of time researching it, or do you just sort of have the kernel of the idea and start writing and see where it takes you? What approach do you have?
I like to have 3 ideas before I start work on a book. Okay. 1 doesn't feel like enough, but 3 that can be completely disparate initially. And then once I start to see how they can fit together, I think, yes, this could work. That's when I start the research, and I might spend 2 to 3 months researching before I start work. So I might start off with the location, because that's an easy one. If I've decided what sort of profession my main characters are in, I will research how they go about their daily lives, how they do their jobs. If there's a particular mental condition that I'm going to explore, I'll read all about that. And as I'm doing that, I'm making notes and I'm getting ideas for further bits of research, and I might start to have ideas for plot developments and for how a chapter can work, and maybe even I'll get snatches of dialogue as I'm doing this. So at the end of this process, I've got a fairly detailed plan that I can work to, that I can use to structure the novel.
And when you've...
Sorry, no, you go.
When you have these kind of ideas, you've got 3 ideas, and you say, I'm going to work out how I can build these up into a full book. Where does the idea itself come? The first idea come from? Because I think I read somewhere that you can get inspiration from like an area like the Moors Murders, Yorkshire Ripper, etc. For that kind of location can inspire something. But how do you tend to find that first spark of an idea that takes you off on your journey?
It is often something out of the ordinary in ordinary life that strikes me. So to give you an example, I was sitting in Waterstones in Manchester a couple of years ago, meeting one of the booksellers there. And at the opposite side of the room, out of the corner of my eye, I could see a couple. And the man was playing with the woman's hair. And he was doing this all the time they were talking. And I must have been there for a good half hour. And he was constantly playing with her hair, twirling it around in his fingers. I thought, bloody hell, that's creepy. Stop it. But that has stayed with me ever since. And maybe one day that will be one of the 3 ideas that eventually come together. And to give you another example, I lived very close to Oxford, and a few years ago there was a dreadful car accident on the Oxford Ring Road, when a woman was taking children home from a party, and she overfilled her car. So there were children in the car who didn't have a seatbelt. Something happened. There was a dreadful accident, and a number of the children were either killed or badly injured. And and that's the sort of thing that stays with you for a very long time. And the worst of it was that the mother was friends with the mothers of all the children who'd been hurt in the car. I thought, how do you ever come to terms with the fact that you might have killed your best friend's child? So that idea eventually became Little Black Lies. So it's just things that strike me as being a little bit out of the ordinary, interesting. And of course, the book isn't fully formed straight away. I'll have to file that idea away and sort of let it mull over it in my subconscious, possibly for years. But there should come a time when I can see how it could work.
Yeah. I suppose if you've got that kind of snatch of something, like someone playing with someone's hair, or a story that stayed with you, if it stays with you for long enough, there's the reason why it stayed
Yes,
with you.
exactly.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah,
People
exactly.
say you should carry a notebook everywhere. Well, I'm just not that organized.
Yeah.
But I think if I had to write them down, they wouldn't be powerful enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I can remember them without doing that, then they are.
Yeah. So your new book is The Split, which isn't set in the north of England, as I said. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, where it's set and what it's about?
Yes. Well, there is a common theme to my settings, because I am very much a writer of British mysteries, right? All my settings are British, even the ones that aren't set in the British Isles, right? So I've set 2 books overseas. One was in the Falkland Islands, which is a British protectorate. And while I was researching that, I came across this other island, also a British protectorate, some 4 days sail away from the Falkland Islands, closer to the Antarctic. It's probably one of the most remote communities on the planet. I can't think of one that is more so. It's called the island of South Georgia, where the summer population is something like 25 and the winter population a dozen, mainly scientists. And it has the grimmest, darkest of histories, because for a long time it was the centre of the whaling industry in the Southern Ocean around Antarctic. So there's 4 or 5 stations there, and at one time 1,000 men lived and worked on South Georgia, chasing whales, catching whales, processing the oil to send back to the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, so this island practically wiped out the whale population in the Southern Ocean. And reading the detail about how the whaling industry took place, I mean, it's just horrific. It really is. So it's an island that's now incredibly beautiful, but has this really dark history. It was involved in the Falklands War. Ernest Shackleton, the famous British explorer, has a history there. So lots and lots of interesting stuff about it. I thought, I decided years ago that one day I would write a book on South Georgia.
So that's one of those ideas that you had in your head.
Yes.
And
South Georgia was waiting.
Yeah, exactly. and so that's the location of it. But do you want to tell us what the plot?
Sure.
Of the
Well,
book
it's
is?
I conceived it as a classic chase thriller. Woman running away from a man who is threatening in some way. I've written one of those previously, a book called Dead Woman Walking, which was very successful. So there is something about that trope that catches the imagination of crime readers. They like that. So I thought, I'll write one of those in South Georgia. So when the book opens, we see the main character, who is a glaciologist. She's a scientist called Felicity Lloyd. And she is dreading the arrival of the last cruise ship of the summer season. Because once this ship has come and gone, right, nobody else can get to South Georgia for the next 6 months. It's winter, boats don't come here. And she knows she's safe. But on this last boat could be her estranged husband, Freddie, of whom she is terrified. She has run to the very ends of the earth to get away from him, right? And she cannot relax until she knows whether or not he's on board. Well, spoiler alert, he is. And we find that out very quickly. So we follow Freddie as he's approaching the island, and he lands and he goes off in search of Felicity, and we follow Felicity as she goes into the hinterland of the island, because she knows it very well and she's very much at home in this extreme environment, and she believes she can hide. So he's chasing her across this frozen wilderness. And at the end of part 1, the 2 of them come together. Now, I knew that when they do, what happens will be a big surprise to the reader. It is not what we're expecting, right? So that was the idea that started the book. And when I started working on it, I didn't know why she was running from Freddie, what their history was, what was going on in her head. There were lots of questions that I knew the reader would have. Well, I have them too.
Yeah.
And that I knew I would have to sort of answer and explain in part 2, 3, and 4.
Excellent. And when you're doing a setting like that, that's a very enclosed setting, a lot of classic stories as well have that sort of, I'm thinking of sort of a locked room type setting, where that and it's the setting itself can almost become a character and become it adds itself to the sense of dread, and you know, because you can't get out of it, you know that this is where the whole story is being told. You know, is it fun to write a story with that
yes.
as a...
There is a reason why so many crime novels and thrillers are set on islands.
Mm-hmm.
They are perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's partly the sense of a community apart that might have its own rules and regulations and ways of doing things. And it's partly that when the sun goes down and the aeroplanes stop flying and the ferries stop sailing, there's no way off.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often they're quite small communities, relatively few roads and very few houses, and so not many places to hide. And to that extent, South Georgia is the ultimate island because you can't fly there.
Mm-hmm.
It's too far for helicopters. The only way off is on a ship that don't come very often, and it will take 4 days to get to the nearest place of civilization. That's the Falkland Islands, which isn't very civilized.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to write about, you know, a claustrophobic, hostile island, you know, I'm not sure that you can get much better than South
It doesn't
Georgia.
sound like it.
But I tell you what I found. It was almost too atmospheric and too oppressive a setting. And some readers have echoed this. They've said they find the chapters in part 1 quite hard to read. Mm-hmm. Quite intense. And I think I must have had a sense of that while I was writing, because I got to this when Freddie and Felicity meet, I thought, I've got to get off this island. Mm-hmm. You know, it's too intense. So we go back in time then 9 months to an environment that I thought was the most complete opposite to South Georgia, and that's the city of Cambridge in the middle of a heat wave. Mm-hmm. So you have this seat of civilization, this ancient place of learning, probably the most civilized place you can think of, and it's very hot. So sharp contrast in the setting, but here we find out why Felicity is the way she is, and why she's so frightened of Freddie. And the threat changes here. It's not so much external, it's more what's going on in Felicity's head. Mm-hmm. So the novel opened out a lot for me in part 2. It's no longer just the classic chase thriller. It's something quite different. It becomes much more of a psychological thriller. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when you have a story that's really set in one location, I think it's difficult to maintain that for a long time, because I think it does get oppressive, and also I suppose you're limited in what you can physically do. You know, there's not much places you can go, people you can meet. Whereas,
absolutely,
I think when you do open up into the Cambridge setting, it's almost like a release, isn't it? It's like you get a bit of a kind of breather, and you get a lot more scope to set up the final act, etc. So yeah,
I had boxed myself into a corner in the South Georgia setting because there are no roads on South Georgia, and there's no infrastructure. There are practically no buildings. It's just ice and mountains. There is nowhere else I can go with it. So it was quite a relief to be able to sort of go to somewhere very different.
And when you're writing a story like that, obviously it has to be well, you know, I think this is true of all crime novels, in fact, that, you know, they have to be well structured for them to work, you know, the pacing of it and everything like that. I mean, are you someone that likes to revise as you write it, or do you sort of get to the end of a draft and then say, right, okay, now let's fix this bit, let's fix that bit? What's your both, right? Okay.
Yeah. I start every day by going back over what I wrote the previous day and doing a little bit of editing as I go. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly polishing. And I find that quite helpful, because by the time I get to the end, I'm sort of ready to carry on.
Yeah.
It's a good way of introducing myself to that day's work. But I would also probably do quite a lot of structural changes when I finish the first draft. I'll realize things that aren't quite working. I changed quite a lot in the split. Before I even sent it to my editor, because I realized there were just too many. I mean, it's quite a complex idea at the heart of it, which we can't really talk about because it will spoil it for people who haven't read it. But Felicity is suffering from a condition that it was quite tricky to manage without giving too much away. Yeah. And the first draft, I didn't get it. I knew I hadn't got it right, so I had to go back and look at that again. And also the very first chapter, which introduces her to the reader, I wrote after the book had been edited twice.
Okay.
So the structural work can go on for quite some time after the first draft is done.
And when do you know, we've had this conversation before, when do you know when a book is ready to be shown to someone? You know, how many drafts do you do before you think I can show it to someone? And do you show it to someone at home first to test it, or do you go straight to the editor? No.
It typically goes to my agent first.
Right.
I sometimes wish it didn't, because she's very, very critical. But so my agent will see it first. She might have some suggestions, but she's not an editor. She would never claim to be an editor. So her suggestions are quite light touch. And then the two of us will send it to my editor. So she's the first person to really get her hands on it. And it might go backwards and forwards from me to her 2 or 3 times before we're happy with it. And then the production process starts.
And how do you deal with, you know, again, we cover this with a lot of our guests, but, you know, the reactions of different people is interesting. Do you ever get feedback from your editor that you just push back on and say, no, that isn't going to work in this story?
Yes. I liken the editorial process to childbirth. Hell to go through, but worth it in the end, because it always produces a better book. But there are, my husband and son know to come nowhere near me for a few days after I've had the first editorial report back, because even though I've decided the book is complete and perfect before I send it off, you know, I will inevitably get a 10-page report back telling me all the ways in which it's not perfect. And a lot of it won't make sense at first, and I will want to push back. But I've learned not to do that for at least a few days, because over the course of those days, I will start to see how some of the suggestions make sense, and how some of the changes could work and be better. So I will probably take on board sort of 80% of what my editor said the first time around. So I'll send back a draft that is much improved, and she will be glad that it's much improved. And then she might have a few more suggestions, and that goes on until there's practically nothing left to change.
I think it's probably true for a lot of people, because you've been so close to the thing for so long, and you've kind of worked through it in your head, and you think, right, this is how this works. This is who these characters are. So when you first get that feedback from someone, even if it's someone you respect, like the editor, it can be, you know, I think it's quite a natural reaction to sort of go, no, wait, that's not right. I've been doing this for 6 months. I've been with these people. I know how this works. But as you say, if you sort of take a bit of time away, it does sort of seep in and say, well, yeah, maybe that does work actually. You've written a few. You've written a variety of novels that some are part of a series and some are standalone. Do you have a preference for what type of novel you write?
I have a strong preference for standalone.
Right.
Because that's what I like to read. I like a story that's complete in itself. And I think if the characters have achieved any sort of happy ending, then we should leave them to get on with it. You know, how cheated did we feel after Aliens, when they did another film, and the happy ending we thought we had with Ripley and the little girl and the lovely lieutenant just didn't. That should have been left as it was.
No, it was ruined. It was ruined off screen before anyone even saw it. It's one of my pet hatreds of Alien 3 is the ruining of those characters off screen before the film even starts. Yes, absolutely.
I'm glad we see eye to eye on that. So I have a preference for standalones, but I did write a series. I started a few years ago with a central character, a young detective called Lacey Flint, who is hiding a very dark and damaging secret that if it ever comes to light will destroy her. And I wrote 4 Lacey Flint books, and they did very well. They were popular. And to this day, I get emails from readers most days saying, when are you bringing her back? And I've always said it has to be the right story. And I haven't yet had a Lacey Flint story. Well, that's what I've been telling them. But I have now had a Lacey Flint story idea.
Excellent.
So the book that I'm working on at the moment, that I'm about halfway through the first draft, is the Lacey Flint story. So I've gone back to my series, and I'm enjoying it so much. It's like finding old friends again.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there pressure on you from the publishing side to write more in a series? Or are they quite keen on you writing more because the fans enjoy those books, they know what they'll sell, etc.?
In the beginning, yes. I was pushed into writing a series by my publishers at the time. They argued that all successful crime writers had a series character. So I went along with that. That is not the case now. Standalones are much more fashionable than they were, say, 6-7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So no, there's no pressure on me at all to write a series or a standalone.
And do you ever, this is especially for crime novelists, I think, do you ever have that sort of block of, right, what am I going to write next? How am I going to come up with something original that hasn't been seen before in terms of a crime novel?
Oh yeah, I all the time. I hear of I see writers on Facebook saying they've got sort of dozens of ideas for stories. I think,
can I have one, please?
No, and I was getting really worried this year because I was working on a different novel that would have been a standalone that I'd argued I wanted to write. I'd got quite excited about the idea, and I'd got 50,000 words into it. And I thought, I can't do this. It's just, I can't see where it's going to go from here, but I've got nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this or nothing. So I was pushing on with it and pushing on with it. It was like pulling teeth. It was, and then thank God I had this Lacey Flint idea. And it's one that I'd been mulling over for a long time. It wasn't a new idea. I thought, oh, actually, yes, that. But it really was 11th hour stuff.
Mm-hmm. No, it can be. I can see that, particularly in that genre, it seems to me that the pressure to come up with new things all the time must be pretty difficult. But yeah, fortunately, you were able to come back with a different idea.
It doesn't have to be an original idea, though.
No.
It could be an old idea done a different way.
Absolutely,
that would work very well.
And of course, Sacrifice was turned into a movie in 2016, I think it was. What was that like? Were you excited when that happened?
Of course, yes. I mean, well, it's sold. The movie rights sold before it was published.
Right.
So it was probably about 8 years between the rights selling and the film being made.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, we went through so many ups and downs. Went so many times we thought the project was over, it wasn't going to happen, and eventually it did. So yes, there was a period of huge excitement when it was all coming together, and I flew over to Dublin to watch the filming one day, which was one of the most exciting things that's ever happened to me. Seeing it all come to life was brilliant.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it was great. But it doesn't happen very often, sadly.
Yeah.
I wondered about, what kind of involvement, I presume, like most authors, once the rights were bought, you didn't have much involvement with it at all, but did you have any say over anything, or did you get to see scripts or go on set?
Yeah, the company that bought Sacrifice were quite a new startup film company. So they were quite amenable to me being involved, particularly in the early stages. So I think I had 4 versions of the script sent to me, and I did give my own feedback. Maybe they weren't quite so keen on the feedback because they stopped sending me scripts.
Is it quite an exciting thing to see other people take your characters and turn them into film versions, or is it quite nerve-wracking? Were you worried about them ruining characters or ruining a story that you'd done, or were you just happy to see someone else run it through their eyes?
I was relatively relaxed. I knew that the film company would make changes to the story and that was inevitable, because a story that works well in a book will not necessarily work in the same way.
Absolutely.
For example, at Sacrifice, we spend an awful lot of time inside the main character's head. And a lot of the time she's sitting at her computer researching. Well, that's not going to work on film. I knew that. I knew they'd have to change things. So I was relaxed about that. I particularly loved seeing the actors get involved. It had a very good cast, especially Radha Mitchell as the main character. And I was in awe of how much emotion she could put into a single line. And some of the lines that she used were straight out of the novel. So she was she wasn't reading at the script writer's lines, she was reading mine. And that was brilliant. That was really nice, good to see.
Yeah, no, it must be an exciting
very
moment.
exciting. Yeah, totally.
I did like that. That's my favourite scene.
Yeah, I wrote that.
Yeah,
Would you ever want to try writing a screenplay yourself? Or
and I have done. Nothing that's ever been taken up, but yeah, I've worked on I was a writer attached to a Lacey Flint adaptation for a while, which hasn't gone anywhere yet. Yeah, I enjoy screenwriting. It's a very, very different discipline. I mean, so much blank page, and every word has to count. You know, you can waffle in a novel. You cannot in a screenplay. You can't waste words.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's very different, but I do enjoy it.
I mean, I think you're right. It's a very different beast, but it's quite satisfying, and because I suppose you're in a separate way. You're pushing the focus onto the dialogue more and onto the actions, as opposed to the inner monologue, which you can really get into in a story.
I met in Harrogate a few years ago the writer of I Am Pilgrim.
Oh, right, yeah.
Help me out with his name. What was he called?
I've got it.
It might come to me.
Bookshelf behind him. Tarek's currently looking.
Oh no! I borrowed it from a friend. I don't have it. It's not mine.
The minute we stop talking, I will remember.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a lovely chap, and I had breakfast with him at the Harrogate the Harrogate Crime Writing Festival.
Terry Hayes,
and he's a screenwriter. I think he wrote the Mad Max.
Oh, right.
I think.
He did write some script stuff.
Yeah.
Was it Bourne movies he was involved in as well?
Oh, I don't know.
We'll just make it up. He wrote the Bourne movies.
You're telling me the key to a great screenplay is minimum dialogue.
All right, okay.
You've got to convey what's going on without the characters speaking. Ooh, wow. That's going to be a challenge.
I mean, yeah, you don't want sort of expository. And now this is
why
this
it doesn't
happened.
work in a screenplay. You've got to do it through what the characters do. So try and a look maybe, or
that's interesting. And it was I've just had a quick look at him. It is he did write Mad Max 2 and 3.
What's his name?
Terry Hayes.
That's it. Yeah. Nice chap.
Excellent.
I didn't realize it was because I mean the I am Pilgrim was a fairly recent novel, wasn't it?
Few years ago now.
Yeah. That's
massive book.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's good.
Hasn't written.
That's one I can see being turned into a film quite easily, I'd imagine.
Oh, I'm sure. It will be.
So we've got a Lacey Flint novel coming next. Are you already?
No, not next. Not next.
Oh, is it not? Is that what you're writing just now?
Okay.
Okay. So that's what I was going to ask then. So what? So you've got the split coming out. I think is it next week? As we film this?
Well, it will. The paperback is out tomorrow, the 22nd, in some shops, and then a mass sort of roll out next week.
And so that's the split, and you've already then got another book lined up for next year. Is there one? Yes, yeah. We try to work a year ahead. So the book that comes out next spring, I'd love to tell you the title, but it was just announced to me yesterday that they've changed it. Oh,
okay. So I'm not entirely sure what the title is anymore. But it's very much a closed room mystery.
Okay, cool.
In that it's a very small cast of characters. There are only really 6 main characters, which is very unusual for me. And when we first meet them, It's the night before they get their A-levels. They're the senior prefect team at a prestigious public school in Oxford. And they're expecting, they've all got places at Oxbridge or Imperial or Durham. They're expecting great grades the following day. But that summer, they've been doing this sort of stupid daredevil stunt. They've all been piling into one car, driving to the nearby motorway and driving onto the motorway on the wrong carriageway, just for one junction and then coming off again. 5 of them have done it, and it's the last chance for the 6th, the youngest member of the group, for him to do the dare. So they all get into the car and they drive, and it all goes horribly wrong. There is a horrible crash, and a woman and 2 children are killed. So their golden future is just disappearing before their eyes. And they decide that instead of all of them taking the blame and going to prison for the next 10 years, only one of them will. One will say that he or she was in the car at the time alone, right? And she'll take the rap for the group. But when she comes out of prison, they will all owe her one favor. Anything she asks,
I like that.
whenever she asks it, they'll have to pay her back. So that's the conceit of the story.
That's a great setup. Yeah, I like that.
A lot of I'd be stressed out as to what I would ask for my favors. How is this? We could really do with a Chinese meal. It's raining outside. Get someone to bring me some food. That's wasting the favor. It's going
to be worse than that.
What was the last book that you read?
Oh no, this is embarrassing. Okay, it was a Georgette Heyer. Friday, I think it's called something like Friday's Child. So Regency romance. Okay. And I would never have thought of reading Georgette Heyer, but I've been seeing my fellow crime writers, people I know and respect on Twitter, talking about how great they are. So I've got to give it a go. And actually, they are quite fun.
No, there's nothing wrong with the bit of,
They are, the dialogue, they're quite clever. They're cleverly written. They're fun. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of pressure to read, literally classics, and there's nothing wrong with reading a bit of escapism, easy reading sometimes just to recharge your reading battery sometimes. So that's fine.
So no, Georgette Heyer, Friday's Child.
Excellent. What about the last film that you watched?
Oh God, this is embarrassing too. Oh no, and I can't remember the name of it, but it had that big handsome bloke. Oh Lord, I'm so hopeless. It was about a genetic experiment that went horribly wrong, that resulted in an albino gorilla growing to monstrous size.
It's
Rampage
with the Rock.
That's it.
The Rock, the big handsome guy.
I watched Rampage.
Was it good?
Yes.
I've got that on my Netflix list. I've not watched it yet.
What's he called?
The Rock.
Dwayne
Johnson.
Dwayne Johnson.
Yeah, I like him.
And the last TV show?
Oh no. I'm kind of addicted to Modern Family at the moment.
All right. Okay.
Oh yeah, no, it's good.
That's good.
It's just 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And I can put it on while I'm making dinner. And it's just a heartwarming and fun, and
I like a nice easy 20-minute watch, so you can just put on whenever and just you have to sit down.
Don't watch crime drama; they're too stressful.
And the very last thing we do is a quick fire either or, so there's no right or wrong answer apart from one. And the first one is romance or crime.
Crime.
TV or cinema.
Cinema.
A fancy restaurant or a takeaway?
Fancy restaurant.
And last one, real book or ebook?
Real book.
Unfortunately, that is the wrong answer.
Yeah, Tarek doesn't like that
answer.
answer.
Oh, I read ebooks as well.
Oh, I'll take that. That's fine then. That was a lot of fun, and quite interesting what she was saying about the fact that back in the day, the kind of perceived notion was that men wouldn't read crime novels written by women. Had to hide the surname, had to hide the first name.
Yeah, it's odd, but like you said back in the day, but I think it probably still
not been
persists
that long
now.
ago. And you're right. Yeah, probably still people who think that way.
It is. It's an odd thing to think that people think that women can't write crime or something just because they're a woman. It's when you think of some great. Well, even things like Agatha Christie, going back, one of the most famous crime writers ever.
Yeah, it's a strange, and it's in some ways it's kind of a letdown when a kind of publisher has that view, because I'm sure they've got the data and stuff to support what they're saying, but you kind of want them to be the ones changing that. If that is the case, you want them to be leading the way.
And also, I do wonder about these things, these data points that they have, because it's the sort of thing that is like, if it's not been tested, then of course your data will keep saying the same thing to you.
Yeah, exactly. Someone has to go out there and change it.
Exactly. Yeah.
What happens? Yeah.
Exactly. But anyway, she is now. All her books are now Sharon Bolton, which is good to say, and her latest is The Split. So you can pick that up now. It's definitely worth picking up. But thanks a lot to Sharon for taking the time to come on to the podcast. Really enjoyed that. And who have we got on next week, Tarek?
Well, next week we have a rather interesting guest. We have Helen Lederer, who a lot of people may know as Katrina from Absolutely Fabulous, the BBC One comedy show from back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
She's also written a couple of books. She's written a number of scripts. She's written stand-up. She's done a lot of writing.
A lot of different... Yeah, exactly. A lot of variety in terms of writing. And, it was really interesting speaking to her about how that differs, how you writing a stand-up show differs from writing a novel and a column and things like that, how she structures these different things. And I also chat to her a lot about the Comedy Women in Print Prize that she set up, which, going back to what we were saying about the whole SJ thing and women writers, it is important that awards recognise this, and it's another way of getting these books into the minds of people so that they then pick them up and try them out. And it's had some really great winners as well. So it's a really interesting and fun episode as well. She's really good fun to speak to. So please do tune in for that one. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UK Page One, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.